Could you briefly summarize what's your research all about?
I'm doing research on two main things at the moment. One is telepathy through social media, through mobile phones, and I'm developing a range of automated telepathy tests so that people can do these anywhere using modern media. The other research is on morphic resonance, and I have some experiments in the planning stages at the moment in psychology, cell biology, and chemistry.
So could you summarize your latest research results?
The most recent research I've done on telepathy is on telepathy in connection with telephone calls. Many people have the experience of thinking of someone who then rings. They say, "It's funny, I was just thinking about you." Is it just coincidence, or is there more to it than that? I've now done many experiments on this subject, and we've found that people are guessing who's calling them way above the level of chance coincidence. There really seems to be a telepathic connection. When someone forms the intention to call another person on the phone, the person they're going to call often feels that intention even before the telephone call comes. So I think this is an example of telepathy in everyday life.
And telepathy itself is basically just an aspect of your more general hypothesis, right?
Telepathy is something that happens between bonded members of social groups, and it fits with my idea of morphic fields and morphic resonance, which is why I got interested in telepathy in the first place. In the theories I'm putting forward, telepathy seems a natural, normal way that the world works, not paranormal, not supernatural, and indeed it does seem to be normal and very common.
What would be the benefit for society as a whole if they would, know about your research and the results you've gained?
My research all points towards a more holistic view of nature. Members of social groups are interconnected. We're linked to each other and to our environment. The whole universe is holistic rather than mechanistic. We're connected with the natural world, we're part of it. So the general message of all this research is about interconnection and a more holistic approach. And I think this is something that we need because we live in a very separated, mechanistic kind of world.
Which professional groups do you think would benefit most from your research?
I think my research is relevant to medicine because it points towards a more holistic understanding of the body and of healing. To psychology, because it points to a wider understanding of the mind. For ecology and our relationships with the natural world. And for biology and chemistry, because I think both of them are evolutionary sciences, and physics even, because I think the whole cosmos is evolutionary. And I think there's a basic memory in nature which affects physics, chemistry, and biology. So they're very far-reaching implications.
So you just said cosmos. How do you understand cosmos? What is cosmos for you?
Well, cosmos is the totality of all that is. It's the universe, and the Greek word cosmos means order. And the universe reveals all sorts of order, regularities, patterns, which I think of as habits. And our modern understanding of the cosmos is that it's like an evolving organism. It's not a machine running out of steam, as people thought in the 19th century. It's a developing, evolving, creative organism.
Why would I tend to believe that it's not a machine? I mean, there are planets surrounding the stars, it's all in an orderly fashion, as you said. It works like in a clockwork, doesn't it?
No, the universe doesn't really work like clockwork. First of all, in Newtonian physics, people thought that it worked like clockwork, but even in Newtonian physics, no one has been able to solve the three-body problem, which is, Newtonian physics works well if you have two things interacting. As soon as you have three or more, the interactions become much too complex. And actually, even the solar system turns out to be chaotic in the sense of chaotic dynamics. It's not predictable in the long term. So the old illusion of mechanistic certainty and predictability turns out it is an illusion. So I think the solar system itself is evolving. The whole universe has evolved. A clock presupposes a clockmaker who creates the machinery. But the universe was not created as one working machine. The universe has developed from the Big Bang, which was very small, less than the size of a head of a pin. The universe has grown and developed. It's much more like a developing organism than like a machine.
And yet there seems to be a blueprint behind it, some order, superior principle that seems to form matter and all, and that's what your hypothesis is all about, the morphogenetic fields, right?
I don't think morphogenetic fields are pre-existing blueprints before the universe. I'm not a Platonist. Platonists think that there's a kind of eternal archetype for everything that happens. My theory is radically evolutionary, and I think that the order, the patterns in nature are habits. I don't think they've all been there in some kind of transcendent design or blueprint. I think they're habits that have grown up in the course of cosmic evolution.
So what is a morphogenetic field? What does it contain?
A morphogenetic field is an organizing structure, a region of influence. Fields of every kind are extended in space and time and bring about order or structure. The gravitational field is what keeps the planets in their orbit around the sun, and also it makes stars and planets round, or more or less round. The electromagnetic field underlies light and radio waves and X-rays and gives structure and order to atoms and atomic processes. The quantum fields give order and pattern to quantum processes. And I think morphic fields give shape or form to organized systems at all levels of complexity: cells, tissues, organs, organisms, societies of organisms like flocks of birds. So they're ordering principles that give structure and form. They're a bit like plans, or like the architectural plan of a building gives it structure and form. The building contains bricks and cement and building materials. It takes energy to build it, but without a plan or a form, you just have a chaotic pile of building materials. And so I think the morphogenetic fields of animals and plants shape the growing bodies. The fields that organize animal behavior shape instincts and learning and behavior. And all these formative fields are called morphic fields. That's the generic name. And morphic fields include morphogenetic fields to do with morphogenesis, the development of form in embryos and plants. Behavioral fields that organize behavior in animals, mental fields that organize mental activity, and social fields that organize social groups like flocks of birds.
Now, if I were a geneticist, I could imagine I would say something like, "Hey, you're trying to steal my field of work. It's the genes that contain everything, right?"
Well, geneticists do often imagine the genes contain everything, but actually, I think that's a fantasy. I mean, genetics is important, and it's told us very important things. But what genes actually do, we know what they do. They code for the sequence of amino acids in proteins. Genes are about instructions for building a sequence of amino acids in a protein. They give a thread, the thread of the protein. The proteins then fold up to give complicated three-dimensional structures. The genes don't code for that. They only code for the primary structure, the thread of amino acids in proteins. And some genes are involved in the control of the activity of other genes, which affect protein synthesis. That's what genes do. That's what we know. They give organisms the right proteins. But that's all. And how those proteins assemble into cells, how cells build into tissues, how organisms like ourselves develop, is not explained by genetics. My arm and my leg contain exactly the same proteins. They're chemically identical, and yet they have different shapes. Now, the genes don't explain those shapes. That's what morphogenetic fields explain.
So are you saying that genes are just yet another expression of morphogenetic fields?
Not really. I'm saying that genes are a form of chemical inheritance that enables organisms to make chemicals, proteins. That the genes themselves, as molecules, have morphic fields. The proteins have morphic fields. But I don't think they have the role that most geneticists assume. Most people assume they're a program that codes for every detail of an organism. I don't think they do. I think genes are grossly overrated because people have tried to squeeze all of heredity into the genes, whereas the genes are only part of heredity. It's like saying that you can understand the German economy by understanding the way that banks work and the way banknotes are printed and the way euros are circulated. I mean, that's true and that's important for the economy, but it leaves almost everything else out: the shape of buildings, creative ideas, what people's actual activities. So I think there's, in the same way, genetics gives us only a partial understanding of inheritance.
Would you say that the morphogenetic field is some kind of collective memory that we all share?
Yes, morphogenetic fields are shaped by memories. The form of an organism depends on the form of previous organisms of the species. The instincts of a spider or of a mouse depend on the behavior of previous spiders and previous mice. And human minds are shaped by a kind of collective memory from people in the past. This is rather like Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, which he thought of as a kind of collective memory. So our bodies are shaped by a kind of collective human memory of form. Our instincts and our animal nature is shaped by a collective memory, not just of people, but of mammals and our ancestral species, going back for many, many hundreds of millions of years. So all of us are products of memory and of habit, but there's always some measure of freedom as well. And of course, this theory of habit through morphic resonance explains how forms are repeated. It doesn't explain how new ones appear in the first place. So evolution has to involve a kind of interplay of habit and creativity.
You came up with a very interesting term, which is the morphic resonance. What is morphic resonance?
Morphic resonance is the idea that similar patterns of activity resonate across space and time on the basis of similarity. But they work from the past to the present. So it's not symmetrical from the future to the present. It's a memory. It's not an anticipation. So what I'm saying really is that the regularities of nature depend on this memory, and they're based on habits. The conventional view in science is that nature is governed by the laws of nature, which are usually assumed to be beyond space and time, like Platonic mathematical principles. They exist independently of space and time, outside space and time. So there's, as it were, a kind of cosmic mind, at least implicitly, containing these laws. Instead of timeless laws that are outside space and time, I think there are habits inside space and time that evolve along with the cosmos. So that's, in a general sense, what I'm saying. And morphic resonance is my hypothesis of how the habits of nature work.
So the hypothesis is that, let's say, a certain species learns something, and then another species that is similar to that species can learn it too, and quicker?
Well, it is mainly within a species. So this hypothesis says that if a rat learns a new trick, and if hundreds of rats learn a new trick, for example in Berlin, then rats of that same kind or the same breed all around the world will learn the same trick quicker.
Is that true?
Yes, there's evidence from experiments with rats that this actually happens. And the same predictions apply to people. If lots of people learn a new skill, like surfing or snowboarding or something like that, then it should get easier for other people to learn. Now, the human skills do seem to get easier to learn, There could, of course, be other explanations as well as morphic resonance. So to get good evidence for it, you have to look at skills where the tests have remained the same over many years. One example are intelligence tests, which have been done in a very similar way for 70 or 80 years. And all over the world, average scores on intelligence tests have gone up by about 30%. So I think this could be a morphic resonance effect. There's no evidence that people are actually getting more intelligent. They're just getting better at doing intelligence tests. And I think that's because so many people have already done the same tests.
Could you please elaborate on the experiment with the rats in the laboratory? That's really interesting.
The rat experiments were done not to test this theory. They were done to test a different theory. In the 1920s, they started. In the 1920s, there was a big dispute about the nature of inheritance. Did organisms inherit only genes, or could they also inherit the experience of their ancestors? The genetic theory said it's only genes, and genes can only change by random mutation. The other theory, the Lamarckian theory, said that organisms can actually inherit experience of the ancestors. So the experiment was set up with rats learning to escape from a water maze, and subsequent generations of rats whose parents had been trained to escape from the maze learned it quicker and quicker. After 20 generations, they were learning 10 times faster. It was a very big effect. So at first, people thought this showed that there was Lamarckian inheritance, which nowadays would be called epigenetic inheritance, the inheritance of experience. This work was then repeated in Edinburgh and in Australia at Melbourne. And the rats there learned very quickly to start with. They started more or less where the Harvard rats left off. But the most interesting data were from Melbourne, because they found that the rats went on learning quicker and quicker. But this increased rate of learning was not only in the rats whose parents had been trained, but in all the rats of that breed, even if none of their parents had been trained. They were all getting better. Now, if it was only in the ones whose parents had been trained, it could be through a Lamarckian or an epigenetic effect, a modification of the genes, or a modification of gene expression, which is what epigenetics is about. But the fact that it occurred in all the rats of that breed can't be explained in terms of genes or epigenetics. And that's the kind of effect that morphic resonance would predict.
So would that also work among, let's say, different breeds? Or why is that it only works within one? Well,
it depends on similarity. Morphic resonance is based on similarity. So the most effect will be between organisms that are most similar. And that would be rats of the same breed. Now, it might work with rats of different breeds, but not as well. And the same principle applies to humans. Morphic resonance should work most between people who are most similar. And the people who are most similar are identical twins. And there's a lot of research that shows that identical twins, even if they're separated soon after birth, have extraordinary similarities in their lives. Usually this is interpreted to mean it's all genetically programmed. But many of these similarities are so extreme that even geneticists don't think they can be genetically programmed. For example, some separated twins call their children by the same names. Now, no one would expect the names of children to be genetically programmed. But morphic resonance would explain these data very well. And I think the identical twin studies are not, in fact, evidence for strong genetic determinism. I think that they provide very good evidence for morphic resonance.
Are there any other examples for morphic resonance, evidential?
Oh, there are many examples. So morphic resonance applies in developmental biology. Organisms that develop in an unusual way because of a changed environment should develop more easily in the same way if the same treatment is repeated. There's already evidence from experiments with fruit flies that this is the case. And in chemistry, Morphic resonance predicts that if you crystallize a new compound, the more often you crystallize it, the easier it will be to crystallize because a habit builds up. And this is a well-known fact to chemists, that new compounds generally get easier to crystallize. The theory also predicts in chemistry that new compounds should form more stable crystals as the habit becomes established. So the melting point should go up. If the habit of forming and maintaining the crystal form is stronger, it'll be harder to break it down, which means you'll need a higher temperature to destroy it. So that's the melting point. So, and surprisingly, there's already evidence for increasing melting points in new compounds that have been made by people in the last 100 years. The melting points are going up, in some cases by 10 or 20 degrees Celsius. So this is a very surprising prediction of the theory and shocking in some ways, but it does seem to be happening. I recently got some data from a laboratory in America where with a quite new compound that wasn't made until a few years ago, the melting point's already gone up by about 7 degrees. And these chemists are very puzzled by this phenomenon, and they've now got interested in morphic resonance because they can't think of any other explanation. And sometimes when I discuss this with chemists, they put forward a reasonable, normal explanation for this, which is that impurities lower the melting point. As time goes on, it may be that the chemists get better at making the compound, so they have purer samples. That may explain some of this effect, but the data I've just got from America, they're pretty sure that's not the case. Of course, this requires specially designed experiments before one can be sure, but the evidence so far does suggest something like morphic resonance may be going on even in chemistry.
So that would be a morphic resonance that is actually based on the fact that the experiments have been repeated over and over again.
Yes, the resonance is based on the fact that people have made these chemicals over and over again and crystallized them over and over again. So the theory says the more they make them, the more they're crystallized, the more effect there should be from morphic resonance.
Now, there are also some other surprising, astounding facts concerning pets and their owners.
Well, I've been doing research on the morphic fields that connect members of social groups. According to this theory, members of social groups, for example, members of families, or flocks of birds, or packs of wolves, or schools of fish, form bonds with each other. And if they interact frequently, they have a kind of resonant connection even when they're separated. And I think that this is what underlies telepathy, which I think is a normal means of communication between members of animal groups. That's why I got interested in research in telepathy. I'm not primarily a parapsychologist. My interests are not primarily in the occult or mysterious phenomena. I'm a biologist. But when I got interested in this, I realized that this theory predicted that animals should remain in connection with each other even when they're separated. So I started looking at the animals we know best, dogs and cats and other domestic animals. They form strong bonds with their owners. So I wanted to find out if pets have a telepathic link with their owners. As soon as I started asking people who keep dogs and cats and people who train dogs and cats, I found that there are hundreds of stories, thousands of stories about this. I started by looking at the natural history. I collected people's stories. I have more than 5,000 on my computerized database. And these stories fall into quite distinct categories. And of course, skeptics would say, these people are just making the stories up, they don't really happen, or it's all imagination. But at the very least, these stories show a natural history of what people believe about their pets. So the next question is, are these beliefs true or not? First, I want to find out what the beliefs are, then I test them. And I've now tested some of these beliefs, and it turns out that they are true. Many people believe their dogs know when they're coming home. The dog goes and waits at a door or a window, sometimes 10 minutes or more before the person comes home. The skeptics say, well, that's just routine, or it's just hearing the sound of a car coming, or it's just people at home giving the animal clues. So in our experiments to test that, we have people come at random times, unusual times. They don't know in advance when they'll come home. We pick a random time and we tell them by telephone when to go, mobile phone, when to go home. To avoid familiar car sounds, they come in unfamiliar vehicles or travel by public transport or taxis. And to avoid people at home giving the animal any clues, we either do the experiments when there is no one at home or when the people at home don't know when the person's coming. We film the place the dog waits, so we've got a complete record of the dog's movements all the time the person is away. And what we find is over and over again, these dogs go and wait at the door when the person is coming home. With the most sensitive dogs, it's when they form the intention to come home. They start waiting even before they've got into the taxi. So we have a lot of filmed evidence for this. I've published papers on this in scientific journals, and it seems to be a very common phenomenon. And it happens not only with dogs, but with cats and parrots. Some horses know when their owners are coming to visit them, with quite a wide range of species.
You said that telepathy is probably the preferred method of communication among animals, right?
Telepathy literally means distant feeling. Tele, distant, as in television. Pathy, feeling, as in sympathy or empathy. And I think it's a common method of communication among animals, normal, not paranormal, natural, not supernatural. And I think it happens when animals are separated from each other. For example, when wolves are hunting, they leave the young wolves in the den, and they travel hundreds of kilometers sometimes when they're hunting. But I think they remain in connection by telepathy. Now, when they're together, then they're communicating by the normal senses through signs, sounds, and so on. I think telepathy is part of that as well, but you can't separate out the effects of telepathy from normal sensory communication when the animals are close together. When they're far apart, the normal senses can't work, and then you can see purely telepathic communication. But I'm sure it's obviously not the only kind of communication like we're talking now, and talking is the main form of communication here, body language as well. But telepathy may also be playing a fairly minor part. But when people who are bonded to each other, or animals that are bonded to people, are separated, then it's telepathy that can work at a distance. It doesn't work all the time, but if there's a need, it works especially when someone wants to call another person, which is why it happens in connection with telephone calls, or when someone has a need. Often mothers, for example, know when their baby needs them, or if their child has had an accident. Or people often feel when someone they know has died or is in serious distress. So it's to do with calling people when there's a need. That's its primary function among separated animals.
What about swarm intelligence? I mean, if I see a swarm of birds in the sky, they move homogeneously, like one single being.
Yes.
Or a swarm of fish.
Yes.
How do they do that?
Well, I think that the behavior of flocks of birds and schools of fish and swarms of insects are examples of morphic fields of the social group. I think the whole group has a field that includes the individual members. It's a little bit like a magnetic field around a magnet. The magnetic field emerges from individual magnetic domains inside the magnet. There are small magnets within the magnets, which are called magnetic domains. If they're lined up in the same direction, the whole magnet has a magnetic field, and that field in turn works back on the individual domains within it. I think a flock of birds, it is where a whole field emerges from the individual birds. They come together to create a field of the whole group, and then they respond to the field of the whole group. So it's like a swarm mind, a kind of collective mind. it's like a magnetic field when you have iron filings and you move the magnet, all the filings move. They're responding to the field of which they're part. And so I think the behavior of these birds or fish or insects is controlled by this overall field. So this, I think, provides a much better way of understanding it than trying to understand it just in terms of individual behavior and direct interactions with neighbors. And in fact, the best computer models of flocks of birds treat them as field phenomena.
So what if mankind were also to be part of such a collective mind, a collective intelligence?
I think that humans have morphic fields of social groups. We have the most immediate ones, of course, are the groups that we live in, our families. And then football teams have morphic fields, and societies and schools and colleges and groups within armies. And there are many social groups, all of which I think have their own morphic fields with their own habits. And all of us exist within different social groups. We have family groups, we have groups of friends, we belong to societies, associations, institutions. All of these have their own morphic fields. One could say that there's larger morphic fields for different cultures, different nations, and ultimately a morphic field for all of humanity. But most of us are more immersed in the local fields, our local social groups, rather than in the rather nebulous field of all humanity.
Now, how come that all those interesting facts are virtually non-existent in the mass media or in let's say, in mainstream science? How come that they don't deal with it?
Well, mainstream science is strongly based on the materialist worldview. Since the late 19th century, that's been the dominant paradigm or model of reality within mainstream science. And that says that matter is unconscious, nature is made up of mechanical interactions between unconscious particles of matter, atoms, molecules, and so on. And the attempt is to explain life in terms of molecules. So that's why there's a huge emphasis on genetics, the Genome Project, proteomics, proteins, and so on. So this is the strongly reductionist tendency present in science, which is working out this mechanistic agenda. And that's why I think that we need to shift the whole paradigm within science from a materialist worldview to a much more holistic worldview.
But isn't it like a mechanism? I mean, we have laws of nature, constants in nature, which never change, right?
Well, that's the usual assumption, but what I'm saying is the laws of nature evolve in an evolving universe. In fact, they're more like habits, and even the constants may change.
Do you have an example? Can you give us an example?
Well, yes. If you look at the actual measurements of constants, they certainly do change. Between 1928 and 1945, the speed of light dropped all around the world by about 20 kilometers per second. Before that, it was like this, and then it dropped down like that, and there were quite small errors in the measurements, and then it went up again. This is a big change. The speed of light is now given to 4 places of decimals. So a drop of 20 kilometers per second is a huge change. Now, what's going on there? Did the speed of light really drop? Well, if you talk to physicists, they'll say, no, it couldn't really drop because it's a constant. So then why did these scientists all around the world get these lower measurements of the speed of light? Well, they said, well, no, that was just a kind of fashion. They expected that kind of result, so they corrected their data to get the expected result. So basically they're saying we can't trust the data. So here you have a conflict between experimental evidence and dogma wins. Many scientists say it's just a matter of facts. We're interested in facts. Well, when the facts don't agree with the dogma, people aren't very interested in the facts. They just say, oh, that was an error. We now know the correct value. In fact, the speed of light was defined by an international committee in 1972. So the present value is fixed by definition. And you would never notice if it really changes because the meter has now been defined in terms of the speed of light. So the units will change with the speed of light. The gravitational constant has been varying quite a lot. Even in the last few years, it's varied by more than 1%, which is quite a big error when people assume it should be given to many places of decimals. And I think that the measurements in different laboratories, which give different values, may actually be correlated. I think that sometimes they may all be high, at another time they may all be low. There may be actual fluctuations in G, the gravitational constant, as it's measured here on Earth. It may not mean that it's varying throughout the universe. It may mean that as the Earth moves through the solar system and the solar system moves through the galaxy, there may be environmental changes that affect measurements of G. So what I'm proposing is that different institutes in different countries put their values of G at different dates online, and then anyone who's interested could look to see if there are correlations. Are they all high at one time and low at another time, or are they random errors? But no one's done that yet, and they don't do it because it's not worth doing. Why not? Because G is a constant, so we won't find any variations that mean anything. They're just errors. You see, I think they may be wrong, and I think this dogmatic thinking actually restricts what we can do in science. This is one of the themes of my book, The Science Delusion, where I argue that many aspects of research are being held back by a dogmatic assumption that we already know the answers in principle.
So with all those morphic resonance effects and morphic field experiments, that to me kind of suggests that there is an interface between consciousness and matter, or that we would have to think about what consciousness is and what matter is after all. Do you have an answer to that?
Well, one of the dogmas of materialistic science is that matter is unconscious and that the universe is made of unconscious matter. That's just one of the 10 dogmas of science. It's simply an assumption. If you look at the history of this, in the 17th century, René Descartes defined matter as unconscious, and human consciousness, he said, is separate from matter, it's immaterial, and the only forms of consciousness in the universe are humans, angels, and God, but everything else, including the human body, is totally unconscious. This is, of course, the familiar philosophy of Cartesian dualism. He made a sharp separation between consciousness and matter's unconscious, by definition. So modern science has inherited this philosophy from the 17th century. But Descartes was a dualist. Materialists who've dominated science for the last 100 years reject the idea there's an immaterial spirit. So at one stroke, they get rid of angels and God. So they create a thoroughly atheistic philosophy. But that leaves them with the problem of human consciousness. Humans ought not to be conscious if matter's unconscious and we're just matter. If we're just machines, lumbering robots, as Richard Dawkins puts it, then we shouldn't be conscious at all. And indeed, in the English-speaking world for the last 50 years, most philosophers of mind have spent their efforts trying to prove that we're not conscious, that consciousness is just an illusion and we're just machines. Now, they're not very successful because most people, of course, persist in believing that they are conscious because they have conscious experience.
How dare they?
But even the materialist philosophers are conscious, so they have to say it's an illusion. But that doesn't explain it, of course, because illusion is itself a form of consciousness. They presuppose it. So there's this futile debate been going on among philosophers of mind for decades, never resolved and irresolvable. Which simply can't explain consciousness. And in the 20th century, in the English-speaking world, the dominant school of psychology in universities was behaviorism. Behaviorism said that the only thing that you can study scientifically is measurable behavior, that consciousness is a meaningless concept that should be expelled from science. Science is about objective facts. Consciousness is subjective and therefore unscientific, and should be ruled out completely from any rigorous scientific understanding of nature. Consciousness is subjective, unreliable, and in fact illusory. So it's an extraordinary position that they've put themselves in, and it's a remarkable thing that intelligent, educated people for generations now have taken this to be the truth about the world, when it so denies their own consciousness and the reality of their consciousness and even the freedom of their own decisions, because there's no free will from this point of view. So there's a serious problem about consciousness within the materialist framework, and in fact, among philosophers of mind, it's called the hard problem, because there's no known solution to the existence of consciousness from a materialist point of view.
Why would it be so important for society to know that a stone has consciousness?
Well, personally, I don't think a stone as such does have consciousness. I think that the atoms and crystals within it have a kind of mental life, but I think it's largely unconscious. You know, the mind is not just conscious. A large part of our own mind is unconscious. Everything that's to do with habit is unconscious, really. And I think most of nature has habits. So habits are, in a sense, mental, but not conscious. 95% of our own mental activity, maybe more, is unconscious. So we don't have to suppose that electrons or atoms are more conscious than we are. They're largely habitual. A stone is in fact not a self-organizing unity. I think there's a kind of mental activity or morphic field in all self-organizing systems. That means atoms, molecules, and crystals. But a rock is actually not self-organizing in the sense that a rock is chipped off a mountain by a glacier or a landslide.
But then it changes its form throughout the centuries.
It changes its form not through self-organization, but through, if it's in a river, it gets rounded by external forces. So there's a distinction between systems that organize themselves, plants and animals, for example, or molecules and crystals, or snowflakes, and systems which are composites, which are shaped by external forces only. And the shape of mountains is shaped by glaciers and pushing up from under the earth and so on. So the mountains, I don't think, have the same kind of self-organizing properties, nor do rocks, nor do tables or chairs or man-made machines. They're all formed by external forces. It's like the difference we all learn at school in chemistry, the difference between a mixture and a compound. A compound in chemistry, like methane or benzene, is something where you have hydrogen and carbon joined together in a particular pattern in a self-organizing form. A mixture, like mixing carbon with hydrogen gas or something, is just a mixture, or mixing sand with iron ore. You've just got a mixture because that's put together by external forces, whereas a compound organizes itself. So I think that morphic fields apply to compounds, things that have a self-organizing property, not to mixtures which are aggregated by external forces.
Mm. So if morphic fields are like the decisive factor for the causation of form, then there seems to be a purpose behind it, right? But wouldn't that mean that the whole cosmos has a purpose?
Well, morphic fields have within them what are called attractors. Within modern dynamical theory, in mathematics and in physics, there's a way of explaining things not in terms of how they're pushed from behind, but how they're pulled from in front. And the concept of an attractor is the concept of something which pulls a system towards it. The basic model, the metaphor of an attractor is you have a basin, like a bowl, and you throw little balls into it. And these balls roll around it, and they all end up at the bottom of the bowl. So the bottom of the bowl is an attractor. Wherever the balls come from, whatever speed they come in at, whatever angle, if they're in that bowl, they'll end up at the bottom. So you can model it by saying they're pulled towards this attractor. The other way of doing the mathematics is measuring the pushing force and measuring for each ball the exact details. But it's simpler to say, it doesn't matter about those details, they'll be pulled towards an attractor, which is the end towards which they're moving. Now, mathematical models of morphogenetic fields are based on attractors. A system is pulled towards an end or a goal. So if you germinate a plant seed, an oak seed, then the oak seedling is attracted towards the mature form of the oak tree. If you cut bits off the seedling, then it will grow new shoots, so it can get back to being an oak tree. So it's as if the final form, or the mature form, attracts it. The same is true of animal embryos. They're attracted towards the final form of the organism, and even after damage to the embryo, they can often develop into normal organisms, not always.
And yet there seems to be an interaction between conscious minds of humans and the morphic fields, or let's say the conscious mind of a rat, and trying to find its way out of the labyrinth, and the morphic field, which then causes the other members of the same breed to find its way out of the labyrinth quicker than before.
Morphic fields are goal-directed, and they organize systems towards ends or goals, but these don't have to be conscious. You see, the gravitational attraction that pulls balls to the bottom of a bowl doesn't have to be a conscious force.
How do you know?
Well, it may be conscious, it may not. And the reason I think they don't have to be is that most of our own habits are not conscious. They have ends or goals, and those may or may not become conscious. But most of our physiological activity is purposive too. You and I are breathing now. We're not aware of it. It happens unconsciously. If we stop breathing, if we're held underwater, we become very aware of the fact that we need to breathe, and we start struggling to get into the air because we become conscious of the goal of breathing, of taking the next breath. Normally it's unconscious. So the reason I think that most habits, most attractors, most goals are unconscious is because we know that from our own experience, that most of our own goals are unconscious. And very often people's behavior is motivated by unconscious goals. I mean, people have habits of behavior that they're usually not aware of. And in personal relationships, it's often very annoying for members of their family or girlfriends or boyfriends to find people have unconscious habits. And in relationships, people delight in pointing out the habits that we're not ourselves aware of. So all of us are creatures of habit. And so, again, I don't think we need to assume that the rest of nature is more conscious than we are. We're conscious part of the time, and consciousness has a role to play. Its main role is to choose between possible courses of action. But most of the things which are habitual function completely unconsciously, even though they're goal-directed and purposive.
How do you think society would change if they would take into account your research results? Well,
I think that the split we have at the moment, caused by the materialist and mechanistic worldview, is an extremely unhealthy one. It tells us that our minds are nothing but the activity of our brains, and that we have no real free choice. Now, that's an absurd hypothesis. I mean, even materialists think that they have freely chosen to adopt the materialist philosophy. They don't say, I'm a materialist because my brain makes me believe this. They say, I'm a materialist because I believe in science, reason, and evidence. But the very act of choosing to be a materialist on the basis of science, reason, and evidence itself refutes materialism. So it's an absurd and self-contradictory philosophy that even its most dedicated believers don't really believe, at least when they're outside the seminar room. It creates a terrible split between mind and body. It creates a completely disastrous split when it comes to medicine and healing, because the idea is, I'm my mind's just the activity of my brain, my body is just a machine. If there's something wrong with it, I go to a doctor and get it fixed. with drugs or surgery. But we know that people's minds play a huge part in healing. Even orthodox medicine has to acknowledge this through the placebo effect. The placebo effect used to be regarded as a mere nuisance for drug trials because people who think they're getting a powerful new drug often get better, even though they're only getting a blank pill. This is now universally accepted, and what it shows is the power of belief. What we believe and what we expect affects what actually happens in our own bodies.
And it might not only affect what happens inside our bodies, but since it has repercussions on the morphic field, it also has an effect on other people who are also connected to that, right?
Oh yes, I mean our intentions and our thoughts can affect other people as well as our own bodies. I mean telepathy is one measure of that, but of course everybody agrees that our thoughts and intentions affect others. If I walk into a room feeling extremely hostile and angry, it changes the atmosphere of the whole room, and body language alone can communicate that. So we already know that we affect others through our attitudes and thoughts, even through conventional means, but also through, I think, telepathic and other means.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sheldrake, for this interview, and good luck with your upcoming work.
Thank you.